Now in this video we will study the structures which lie within the substance of the parotid gland. Starting from the arteries, the external carotid artery enters the parotid gland, and within the substance of parotid gland it divides into its two terminal branches. The maxillary artery, which is not seen on any surface on the outer aspect of the skull, and the superficial temporal artery, which emerges from the superior aspect of the parotid gland. The superficial temporal artery within the substance of parotid gland gives off a branch which is called the transverse facial artery, which emerges through the anterior aspect of the parotid gland. This is the transverse facial artery. Then coming towards the veins, the superficial temporal vein enters the parotid gland through its superior aspect, and within the gland the maxillary vein and the transverse facial vein join the superficial temporal vein, and they form the retromandibular vein, which is within the substance of the gland. The retromandibular vein within the gland divides into anterior and posterior divisions, which emerge from the apex of the gland. This is the anterior division of the retromandibular vein, and this is the posterior division of the retromandibular vein. Coming to the nerves, the facial nerve enters the gland from its postomedial surface, and within the gland it divides into two branches, which eventually join to form a loop, and from that loop five branches emerge from the anterior aspect of the gland, which is the temporal, the zygomatic, the buccal, which divides into upper and lower buccal, and the marginal mandibular, then the cervical branch. Now we will split open a parotid gland and see the structures within its substance. I have made a new parotid gland out of Play-Doh to show you the structures within the parotid gland. This is the superficial surface of parotid gland. This is the anterior border, this is the apex, this is the posterior border, and this is the superior surface or the base of the parotid gland. You can see the facial nerve entering the parotid gland from its posterior aspect and its branches emerging from the anterior aspect. And these are the vessels which are within the substance. Now if we open the parotid gland like this, now this is the posterior border and this is the anterior border. In this case, this is the posterior part and this is the anterior part of the gland. This is the facial nerve which enters the parotid gland and divides into two branches. One towards the temporal region, which is called the temporofacial branch, and the other towards the neck region, which is called the cervicofacial branch. These two branches fuse within the gland to form a loop, and from this loop the five branches of the facial nerve emerge: the temporal, the zygomatic, the buccal, which divides into upper and lower buccal branches, then the marginal mandibular, and the cervical. Now these are the vessels within the substance of gland. The veins, this is the superficial temporal vein, this is the transverse facial vein, this is the maxillary vein. When the superficial temporal and maxillary veins fuse, they join to form the retromandibular vein, and the retromandibular vein then divides into anterior and posterior divisions. The arteries, this is the external carotid artery which enters the gland from its postomedial aspect. As it moves upwards, it divides into terminal branches, a maxillary branch and a superficial temporal branch. The superficial temporal branch emerges from the superior aspect of the gland, but the maxillary branch goes deeper towards the pterygopalatine fossa, and it is not seen on the outer surface of the skull. This is the transverse facial artery, which is a branch of the superficial temporal artery. So all these structures are lying within the substance of parotid gland. The plane through which the facial nerve enters and passes uh, within the parotid gland, this plane is considered to divide the gland into a superficial part and a deep part. And the area of the parotid gland within this loop, the loop of the two branches of facial nerve, this part is called the isthmus of the parotid gland.